In this video, I want to have a look at using the method of completing the square to solve quadratic equations. So completing the square is all based on perfect squares. So our perfect square expansions are if we had a plus b squared, that's going to expand to a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. The same with the negative, except we end up with a negative in our answer or our expansion here. Now, the idea with these is that we want to rearrange this equation or adjust it so that it looks like one of these forms, and then it can be factorized back like one of these. So what we're going to do first is we're going to move the constant out of our way, because at the moment this isn't a perfect square. So what we're going to do is we're going to plus 7 in this case to both sides. So our equation will become x squared minus 2x equals 7. Now I've left that gap there because we need to figure out what number we can put in here to make this left-hand side of the equation into a perfect square. The way we're going to do that comes from here. The term that we want to add on the end is a b squared. Now our a's in here are our x's, so we already had an a squared was our x squared, our 2a was a 2x, and we have to figure out what this b term is so that we can square it and add it on the end. The easiest way to do that is to have a look at your coefficient, halve it, which in our case would be half of minus 2, would be minus 1, and then we're going to square that. So minus 1 squared is 1. So that's what we're going to add on to the end. So plus 1, but if we do that to one side of the equation, we have to do it to the other side of the equation as well. So again, we've halved this and squared it, and that's what we're adding on the end. Now that we have it in that form, we can factorize back to something that looks like this. So that means that this left-hand side is going to become x minus 1 squared. The reason it's got the minus in there is because that middle term was negative. So if the middle term is negative, we've got a negative in here. If it was positive, we've got a positive in our brackets when we factorize. All right, so that's the left-hand side, and that's going to be equal to 7 plus 1 is 8. And now we can go through and solve this. So to get rid of this squared, we would have to square root both sides of that equation. So we'd end up with x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. And then we want to rearrange to get the x on its own. So that means we would have to add 1 to both sides of that equation. So we're going to end up with x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 8. All right, so that is our answer. There are two values of x. So we could have x equals 1 plus the square root of 8, or x equals 1 minus the square root of 8. We don't have to write them separately though, we can just leave our answer as that. You could also simplify this third if you wanted to, but you don't have to. All right, so that's one example. Let's have a look at a little one that's a little bit more complicated. So again, we're going to move this constant term out of our way. So we're going to have x squared plus 5x equals, because it was a plus 2, we would have to minus 2 from both sides. Now we want to figure out what term we're going to add in here, and it all is always going to be that we're adding something. So we need to figure out what we're going to add there. The way we do that is to halve this number. So half of 5, we could just write that as 5 over 2 as a fraction. And then we're going to square that. So I'm just going to write that as 5 over 2 squared. And that's what I'm going to add on the other side as well. 5 over 2 squared. And now we can go through and factorize and simplify. So if we have a look at this side, we're going to have x plus, because it was a plus here, and our b term was 5 over 2. So x plus 5 over 2 squared is equal to, if you put this whole thing in your calculator, you're going to end up with 17 over 4. All right, now we're going to square root both sides. So I would have x plus 5 over 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 17 over 4. Now, if you're square rooting a fraction, we can square at the top and the bottom separately. So we'd have x plus 5 over 2 is equal to plus or minus. The square root of 17 isn't a nice number because 17 isn't a square number, but the square root of 4 is 2. So that makes that a little bit nicer. Now we do want to get that x on its own. So we're going to have x equals minus 5 over 2 because it was a positive, so we have to subtract it from both sides, plus or minus the square root of 17 over 2. Now, because they both have the same denominator, they both have a 2 down there, we can write that just as one fraction. So x equals minus 5 plus or minus the square root of 17 all over 2. So those are our two solutions that make this quadratic equation correct.